At my son's rehearsal dinner, he pulled me aside and said, "Mom, tomorrow at the reception, you're sitting at table 9. We need the family table for people who actually matter to the image we're projecting." I smiled and nodded. What he didn't know was that I had written the check for the entire wedding 3 weeks earlier, every last dollar of it. My name is not important. What is important is that I am 71 years old. I spent 34 years teaching second grade in Columbus, Ohio, and I know what love looks like because I practiced it every single day, in the classroom, in my home, and with my son. My late husband, Gerald, and I built something careful and quiet over 42 years of marriage. We didn't take lavish vacations. We drove our cars until the engines quit. We bought a modest house in a modest neighborhood, and we paid it off in 22 years. When Gerald passed from a stroke 4 years ago, he left me with a paid house, a solid retirement account, and one son who I believed would be my greatest comfort. I should have seen it coming. The signs were there, the way weather is there. You just choose not to look at the sky. It started modestly, the way these things always do. My son called a few months after his father's funeral, his voice soft and careful. "Mom, Christine and I are trying to buy a house. You know how the market is. We're short on the down payment by about $18,000. You have all that money just sitting there. I know Dad would want you to help us get started." I transferred the money within a week. He was right that Gerald would have wanted them to have a good start. That part wasn't a lie. Then it was the car. Christine needed something reliable because she was pregnant with my first grandchild. That was $26,000. Then it was the nursery renovation, then private lactation consultants, then a night nurse because Christine had postpartum anxiety and couldn't cope, and I understood that. I genuinely understood it. But no one ever asked me how I was coping with losing my husband of 4 decades while writing checks with his name still printed on them. My grandchildren came into my life, and that was the thing that kept me from seeing clearly. My grandson was born 2 years after the wedding, and my granddaughter 18 months after him. They were the best part of everything. When my son called asking for money, I thought of those 2 children, and I found a way to say yes. He married Christine 7 years ago. She came from a family that spent money like it was a renewable resource, and she had expectations shaped accordingly. I tried to like her. I tried very hard. She called me by my first name from the beginning, which I told myself was modern and fine, but there was something in the way she did it. Clipped, efficient, like she was checking off a task. She managed my son the way she managed their household budget, which is to say she managed it into the ground while projecting the appearance of wealth. My son worked in commercial real estate. Good years were very good. But the bad years, and there had been several, were apparently my problem to solve. I didn't know that for a long time. I thought I was helping. I thought each request was an isolated emergency. It was the wedding venue that finally cracked something open in me, though I didn't act on it right away. When my son announced their engagement 6 years ago, Christine had already chosen a venue, a restored estate outside of Cincinnati. The kind of place that appears in bridal magazines, the kind of place that costs what some people earn in a year. She'd put down a deposit before they'd spoken to me. When they came to tell me their plans, she slid a printed invoice across my kitchen table like we were conducting a business transaction. The total was $64,000. I looked at that number for a long time. "Mom," my son said, "you've always said you wanted to give us a beautiful wedding. Dad had a life insurance policy. You have more than enough. This is a once-in-a-lifetime thing for us." He used Gerald's memory to make me feel that spending Gerald's money was an act of love. I signed the check. What I didn't know, standing in my kitchen that afternoon, was that this would become a pattern so established that 6 years later he would feel comfortable telling me to sit at table 9. The rehearsal dinner was held at a steakhouse downtown. Christine's parents flew in from Scottsdale. They were pleasant enough people, though I noticed they never reached for the check. My son's college friends filled most of the room. I sat next to my sister-in-law, who had driven up from Dayton, and I tried to focus on feeling grateful that Gerald had lived to see his son get engaged, even if he hadn't lived to see the wedding. After dinner, when most people had drifted to the bar, my son found me by the coat check. He was wearing the new suit Christine had ordered for him, the one she'd mentioned, cost more than my first car. He had Gerald's height and Gerald's jaw, and I loved him in the helpless way mothers loves sons, which is to say it was not conditional, but it had apparently taught him nothing about conditions. "Mom," he said, "I need to talk to you about tomorrow." "Of course," I said. The seating chart got complicated. His voice dropped to that particular register he'd used since he was a teenager when he wanted something. "Christine's family has a lot of connections in the room. Business people. Her college network. We need the family table to look a certain way. Professional. Polished. You understand." I waited. "We've put you at table 9. It's a great table. Near the windows. Lovely view of the garden." I understand what he was telling me. Table 9 was for the college roommates' parents and the neighbors from their old street. Table 9 was not the family table. Table 9 was where you put people who mattered less. I smiled. I told him the garden view sounded lovely. What he didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that 3 weeks earlier he had called me in a panic because the payment was due and their cash flow was, as he put it, temporarily constrained. He'd asked me to cover the final balance on the venue, the catering, and the florals. I'd paid $61,000 in a single wire transfer. The wedding Christine had designed to project a certain image to a certain room of people. I had paid for all of it. I drove home from the rehearsal dinner in silence. I sat in my driveway for a long time. The house Gerald and I had bought together was dark and quiet, and it had been both of those things for 4 years. I had learned to come home to quiet, but I had not yet made peace with it. I went inside, and I sat at the kitchen table where Christine had once slid me that invoice, and I opened my laptop. I started with my bank's online portal. I pulled up every transaction going back 3 years, and I made a spreadsheet, which took me until nearly 2 in the morning. The number that stared back at me from that spreadsheet was $212,000. In 3 years. Not counting the original down payment on their house, which I had thought of as a gift, and apparently so had they, because that was another $18,000. $212,000. Gerald and I had saved that money over 30 years of packed lunches and secondhand furniture, and 1 vacation a year, always somewhere we could drive to. I sat with that number the way you sit with a diagnosis. You know it's real. You just need time for real to become actual. I didn't cry. I was surprised by that. I had expected to cry. Instead, I felt something settle in me like ice forming. Not hard and violent, but slow and certain. The wedding was beautiful. That is the honest truth, and I will not pretend otherwise. The estate was genuinely stunning in late September light, the kind of golden afternoon that Ohio offers sometimes in early fall, as if apologizing for February. My granddaughter was the flower girl, and she took the job with a seriousness that broke my heart open with love. My grandson sat in the front row in a small navy suit and fell asleep against my arm during the vows, and I held completely still so I wouldn't wake him. I sat at table 9. The view of the garden was, in fact, lovely. I smiled through the reception. I danced with my granddaughter. I toasted the couple with something genuine, because whatever I felt about my son's choices, I had genuinely liked watching him be happy, and I hoped the marriage would be a good one. But something had changed. The ice that had formed in my kitchen the night before did not thaw. On Monday morning, I called a lawyer. Her name was not one I had used before. She had been referred to me by a woman in my book club whose late husband had been an estate attorney, and this woman, sharp, direct, around my age, came with a specific recommendation. She is the one you want when family gets complicated. I sat across from her in a clean office, and I told her everything. I brought the spreadsheet. I told her about the rehearsal dinner. She listened without interrupting, which I appreciated, because I had spent a lot of years being interrupted. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mrs." She used my name. "You've been financially supporting your son's household, under the belief that these were loans. Have any of them been repaid?" "Not $1, I said. She nodded slowly. "Do you want to protect what remains?" "Yes," I said, "and I want to do it before they realize what I'm doing." She explained the process. A revocable living trust. Transfer of assets. New will with educational provisions for my grandchildren tied to specific ages, so my grandchildren would benefit, but my son and his wife could not access anything directly. It would take 3 weeks to complete. I should expect that once the changes registered, because my son had himself as an authorized contact on one of my older accounts, there would be a reaction. I was ready for the reaction. What I was not ready for was its shape. The call came on a Saturday morning, 11 days after I'd signed the initial paperwork. I was in my garden. I had planted dahlias that spring with the optimism of someone who needed something to tend. My son's voice on the phone was not the voice I'd heard at the rehearsal dinner. It was not careful or managed. It was cold. "Mom, what did you do to your accounts?" It was not a question. "I've restructured my finances," I said. I stepped out of the dahlia bed and stood on the path. "You closed the account I was on. You can't do that without telling me. I was helping you manage things." "You weren't managing things," I said. "You were monitoring my balance." Silence. Then, "That's a terrible thing to say to me. I'm your son. I know you are. I also know that in 3 years you've borrowed $212,000 and repaid 0 of it. Those were gifts. You gave that money because you wanted to help your family. You can't suddenly call them loans. That's not how it works." "I didn't say loans," I said. "I said borrowed. I used your word. You always said you'd pay me back when things stabilized. Things are complicated right now." "The market is." "Bradley got his bonus," I said. "I saw it on LinkedIn. Congratulations." "Substantial increase," the post said. The silence that followed was different from the first one. This one had texture. "You're spying on us now. I'm paying attention. There's a difference." His voice shifted then, lower, and for the first time I heard Christine in the background, coaching, not trying very hard to be quiet about it. When he spoke again, the words had a rehearsed quality. "Mom, Christine and I are concerned about you. You've been alone a long time. Since Dad died, you've made some choices that worry us. This sudden paranoia about money, these accusations, we think you should talk to someone, a doctor. We're going to call Dr. Harrison's office and make an appointment. We just want to make sure you're okay." I let him finish. I said, "I'm going to hang up now. When you'd like to have a real conversation, I'm here." I hung up. I stood in the garden for a long time with the phone in my hand. The dahlias were doing well. I called my lawyer the same afternoon and told her what had been said. The implication that I wasn't mentally capable. She was not surprised. "This is a predictable response," she said, "especially when someone who has been financially dependent realizes the resource is being protected. What you need now is documentation. I want you to write down every detail of that phone call. Time, exact words, tone. I also want you to call your physician today and schedule an appointment. Not because there's anything wrong with you, but because we want a current evaluation on record before they have time to arrange their own." I called my doctor that afternoon. She had been treating me for 26 years, and she knew me well enough to understand why I was asking. She saw me 2 days later. I sat in the exam room in the blue gown, and she asked me the questions, and then she said, very matter of fact, "You're sharp as a tack. I'll have a written assessment ready by Friday. And off the record, good for you." My son arrived on a Wednesday. He brought Christine. They did not bring the grandchildren, and I noticed that. I noticed it because the last time he'd come without the children, he'd been there to tell me his father had had a stroke. They sat in my living room. Christine crossed her legs and smoothed her skirt and held a ceramic mug of the coffee I'd offered, because that is what I do. I offer coffee. It was how my mother kept her hands busy during difficult conversations, and apparently the habit passes down. My son said, "We want to talk about this like reasonable adults." I said, "That sounds good." He said, "We think you've been given some bad advice. By a lawyer, probably by that woman from your book club who doesn't know our family or our situation. We want you to undo the account changes, come back to the original arrangement, and we can agree to a repayment schedule." "A repayment schedule," I said, "for $212,000. We'd need time to work out the specifics," he said. Christine spoke for the first time. She looked at me the way she had looked at that invoice 6 years ago, like this was a transaction to be managed. "We've been struggling," she said. The real estate market has been brutal. We have 2 children in private school. Our mortgage is significant. We've needed support. That's not a crime. And I've been giving it, I said, apparently to people who earn more than I ever did and spend more than they earn. That's insulting, she said. It's arithmetic, I said. My son stood up then. Mom, his voice changed. It went soft in a way that frightened me more than the anger had. Think about what you're doing. Think about the kids. Rosalind asks about you every week. Owen drew you a picture last month. Don't you want to be in their lives? Don't you want Christmas with your family? There it was, wrapped in his grandfather's eyes and his daughter's name. I looked at my son, my child, who I had carried and nursed and read to and taught to drive and cried over and loved past all sense, and I said, I am not choosing money over family. I am choosing to stop being your family's bank. There is a difference, and I hope someday you understand it. He said, if you keep this up, you won't see those kids. I said, I think you should go. They left. Christine's coffee was still half full. I washed the mugs and called my lawyer. She had been waiting for this, or something like it. She told me to stay somewhere else for a week, just in case they decided to escalate. Do you have someone? She asked. Someone you trust completely. I thought of my college roommate. We had been friends for 48 years. She had retired from nursing and moved to a small house in Asheville, North Carolina, and she had called me every week after Gerald died. I called her that evening. She said, come. I'll have the room ready by the time you get here. I drove down the next morning. I left my phone on for the first day and watched the calls come in. 7 from my son, 2 from Christine, 1 from a number I didn't recognize. I let them all go to voicemail and did not listen to them until the second day. The messages started careful. Mom, please call me. This is getting out of hand. We can work this out. Then they became urgent. Then they became something else. You're making a serious mistake. We've spoken to an attorney. There are options available to us if you continue to behave erratically. We are prepared to pursue a guardianship petition. We love you and we want to protect you. I sat in my friend's kitchen in Asheville, and I listened to my son tell me he loved me in the same message where he threatened to have me declared incompetent. I looked at the mountains out the window. She put a cup of tea in front of me and sat down across from me. She had been a nurse for 32 years. She had sat with people at the end of things and in the middle of things, and she had learned, the way nurses do, to speak plainly when plainness was kindness. She said, he's scared. People who felt safe taking something get very scared when it stops being available. But I need you to hear me. What he's doing right now, threatening a guardianship petition, using your grandchildren as leverage, that is not the behavior of someone who is protecting you. That is the behavior of someone protecting their access. I already knew this. Somehow hearing it from outside my own head made it permanent in a way that knowing it hadn't. I spent 5 days in Asheville. We walked in the mornings. She cooked things that required real attention, and I sat at her kitchen counter and handed her ingredients. And we talked about Gerald and her late husband and about the year we'd lived together in a dormitory in 1975 and stayed up until 3 in the morning talking about everything we were going to do with our lives. Some of it we'd done. Some of it had become different things than we'd planned. That seemed all right. When I drove home, my lawyer had filings ready for me to review. The guardianship petition had been submitted. My son had done it. My lawyer had expected this. She had also prepared our response, which included the written assessment from my physician, the neurocognitive evaluation she had arranged during my absence, 2.5 hours, with a specialist who afterward told her office I demonstrated no cognitive impairment of any kind, and a comprehensive accounting of every financial transfer made over the previous 3 years, with documentation. We had also, because the petition was now a matter of public record, submitted a subpoena for my son and daughter-in-law's financial records going back 4 years. My lawyer told me, once they receive notice of that subpoena, watch how quickly this changes. The hearing was set for a Thursday morning in February. I drove downtown with my lawyer and my friend from Asheville, who had insisted on coming, and who wore a good coat and sat very straight in the courtroom as if she were there on official business. My son and Christine sat across the room with their attorney. My son would not look at me. Christine looked at me once, briefly, and I saw something in her face that I had not expected. Not hostility. Something smaller, something that might have been shame. The judge was a man in his late 60s, unhurried, who had the manner of someone who had seen a great many things and was surprised by very few of them. My son's attorney gave an opening that emphasized concern. A grieving widow, unusual financial decisions, sudden isolation from family, the cutting off of an authorized account holder without warning. My son testified that he was worried about me. His voice was convincing. He had always been able to make his voice convincing. Christine testified that I had seemed confused at times, that I had repeated myself on phone calls, that she was afraid I was not capable of managing the magnitude of assets I was dealing with. My lawyer's cross-examination was direct and quiet. She asked Christine how much I had transferred to them in the previous 3 years. Christine said she wasn't certain of the exact figure. My lawyer read the exact figure from the bank records. $212,000. She asked how much had been repaid. Christine said the arrangement had been informal. My lawyer asked how much. Christine said none but. My lawyer thanked her. She asked my son whether he had said on a recorded voicemail that he was prepared to pursue a guardianship petition if I did not restore his access to my accounts. He said he had been concerned about my well-being. She asked him to answer the question. He said, words to that effect, yes. She presented Dr. Harrison's evaluation and the neurocognitive assessment. She presented the financial records. She presented the voicemails, transcribed. The judge did not leave the bench. He looked at the papers for a moment, and then he looked up and he said, the petition is denied. Mrs., he said my name, is clearly competent to manage her own affairs. He looked at my son and daughter-in-law for a long moment without speaking, which was more effective than anything he might have said. Then he said, this court is adjourned. Outside on the courthouse steps, my son tried to approach me. My lawyer stepped between us, not dramatically. Just present, I said. I can't talk right now. He said, Mom, I said, not today. I got in the car. My friend put her hand over mine on the center console. She didn't say anything. That was exactly right. The weeks that followed were quieter than I expected. My son and daughter-in-law stopped calling. The court transcripts were public record, and somewhere in the 3rd week after the hearing, a reporter wrote a short piece, not front page, but not nothing, about elder financial exploitation and guardianship abuse. He used no names, but the details were specific enough that people who knew them would know. I learned from a former colleague of my son's, who reached out to me privately, that the story had moved through his professional circle like smoke. His firm placed him on administrative review. The review lasted 6 weeks. At the end of it, he took a voluntary demotion rather than face a formal investigation. The house went on the market in April. The private school, I was told, was no longer possible. Christine had taken a job, her first in 8 years. I felt no satisfaction in this. I want to be accurate about that. What I felt was something harder to name. A kind of neutral gravity, like watching the result of a law of physics you had not made but could not argue with. In April, my granddaughter called my landline. She was 9 years old. She had apparently looked up my number herself. She said, Grandma, are you mad at us? I sat down on the kitchen floor because my legs needed me to be closer to the ground. I said, No, sweetheart, I am not mad at you, not even a little, she said. Mom says you don't love us anymore, I said. Your mom is wrong about that. I love you every day. That doesn't change, she said. Then why can't we see you? I didn't have a good answer for a 9-year-old that was also honest. I said, grown-ups sometimes have arguments that take a long time to work out. It has nothing to do with you or your brother, she said. Will you come to my recital? It's in May. I'm playing the flute. I said, tell me the date. I called my lawyer the next morning, and she helped me draft a proposal. Educational trusts for both grandchildren. Visitation rights independent of my son and daughter-in-law, meaning if they chose to withhold the children, that would be a matter for the court, but I was establishing my standing. The proposal also made clear that nothing from my estate would flow directly to my son or his wife. Not now, not after. They accepted the visitation terms, they rejected the estate terms and sent a counter-proposal asking for a monthly sum. I declined. My lawyer sent a very brief letter in response. I did not read their reply because there was no reply that required my attention. I went to my granddaughter's flute recital. She played Ode to Joy with 8 other 9-year-olds in descending order of competence, and she was second best, and she knew it, and stood up very straight. My grandson fell asleep in the chair beside me, exactly the way he had at the wedding, and I held still. After the recital, she ran to me in the lobby and hugged me around the middle and said, "You came," as if there had ever been a possibility I wouldn't. My son stood 10 feet away. We did not speak, but I watched him watch his daughter hold on to me, and I saw something cross his face that I recognized because I had last seen it when he was 5 years old, and he had broken a window with a baseball and had to tell us what he'd done. He had been afraid then, not of punishment, of having disappointed us. I drove home that evening and sat in the kitchen and thought about Gerald. He had been a quiet man who loved difficult crossword puzzles and bad science fiction, and the Ohio State Buckeyes with a loyalty that survived every losing season. He would not have liked what had happened. He would not have liked the lawyer, the courthouse, the spreadsheet on the kitchen table. But he would have understood it. He had been, in the end, a practical man who believed that love was not the same thing as unconditional funding, and he had said so once directly when our son was in college and we were having one of our late-night conversations on the porch. "Love is love," Gerald had said. "Money is a separate thing. Don't let anyone convince you they're the same." I had let someone convince me. For 3 years, I had let the love I felt for my grandchildren become a lever that someone else controlled. I signed up in September for a watercolor class at the community center. I was not good at it. The instructor was honest about this in a way I found refreshing. "You're not terrible," he said one Thursday. "You're just fighting the water. Let it do what it wants to do." I thought about that for a long time. In October, I booked a trip to Portugal. 2 weeks. Lisbon and the Alentejo wine country, and 3 days in the Algarve by myself in a small rental house above the sea. When I posted photographs, my former students sent me comments that made me laugh out loud in a restaurant by myself, which I was becoming comfortable with. The letter from my son arrived in November. Plain envelope. His handwriting, not Christine's. He wrote that he did not expect me to forgive him. He wrote that he understood what he had done, not just the money, though he wrote about the money, but what it meant. That he had turned me into a resource. That he had managed me the way Christine managed their household, with an eye toward what he could extract rather than what he was receiving. He wrote that he had started seeing a therapist. That the financial collapse had done something to his marriage that he was not sure could be repaired. That Rosalind asked about me constantly, and that watching her run to me in the recital lobby had been the most ashamed he had felt in his life. He did not ask for money. He did not propose anything. He said he was sorry. He said he was trying to learn how to earn something rather than simply expect it. I read the letter twice. I put it in the drawer of the kitchen table, in the same drawer where I keep the good stationery and the stamps and a photograph of Gerald and me from 1987 in Yellowstone, where we are both squinting into the sun and laughing at something neither of us can remember. Maybe someday I would write back. Maybe someday I would sit across a table from my son and find that what remained between us was something we could build from. I did not know yet. What I knew was that for the first time in years, my calendar belonged entirely to me. I had friends I had made after Gerald died, real friends who knew me as myself and not as someone's mother or someone's widow or someone's emergency fund. I had watercolors drying on my kitchen counter that were getting, slowly, a little better. I had a trip to Portugal in my photos and a recital program folded in my purse, and a granddaughter who had memorized my landline number at 9 years old because she wanted to be able to reach me. I had not known, in that rehearsal dinner parking lot, sitting in my car in the dark, that drawing a line could feel like coming home. But that is the thing they do not tell you about drawing lines. You think it will feel like a wall. You think it will feel like closing something. Instead, it felt like the first day of a season you had been waiting for without knowing it had a name. It felt, after a very long time, like enough. Good day, dear listeners. I'm so glad you're here with me. Please like this video and let me know in the comments what city you're listening from. I love knowing how far these stories travel. If any part of what I shared today felt familiar to you, you are not alone. And if you haven't yet, you are allowed to draw the line.